Wren Ashby shut the cottage door behind her for the last time and told herself she would not look back at it. She looked back 4 times before the lane turned and took the roof from view. The bailiff's men had already nailed the notice to the post, the ink still wet enough to run in the drizzle, and the smell of the place followed her longer than the sight of it did. Wet thatch and cold hearth ash, and the particular sourness of a room that has been picked clean of its furniture in half a morning. She carried a tin box that had been her father's, tools wrapped in oiled cloth so they would not rust before she found use for them again, and in her other hand, closed so tight her knuckles had gone white, she carried a wren no bigger than her thumb, carved from a knot of applewood, its wings scored thin and a little clumsy, as though the man who made it had been in a hurry to finish before someone called him back to real work. He had been. Silas Ashby had carved it in the evenings after mending other men's clocks all day for other men's coin, and he had given it to her on her 7th birthday and said, not the last time he said it, but the first, that a clock which had stopped had not died, it had only stopped asking to be told the time, and a girl was much the same, and should never let anyone tell her otherwise. She had not understood him then. She had buried him 11 months ago in a churchyard 2 parishes over, because the one nearest the cottage would not take a debtor's grave for free. And she understood him rather better now. The debt was the trouble. The debt had always been the trouble, though she had not known, until the men came with the paper this morning, that it had grown so large it could swallow a whole house whole. Old Mrs. Pell caught her at the crossroads with half a loaf wrapped in a cloth, and pressed it into her hands before Wren could refuse it. "You'll not get to Alderford before dark on an empty stomach," the old woman said, and she looked at the sky the way people in that country always looked at the sky before saying anything true, as though asking its permission first. "There's a storm coming down off the Tor," she said. "Keep off the Hall land if you can help it. Old Ashcombe land, all shut up since the young Duke went for a soldier and never came home to open it again. And Crane's men patrol the wall of it like it were the crown jewels behind there, instead of dust sheets." Wren said that she had nowhere particular to be that dust sheets would improve on, and Mrs. Pell laughed, short and without much humour in it, and told her that was exactly the kind of thing her father used to say, in exactly the tone he used to say it in, and that it had never once kept him out of trouble either. The rain found her an hour past the crossroads, and did not let up. By the time the wall of Alderwood Hall rose grey and dripping out of the dusk, she had stopped feeling the cold in her feet at all, which she knew from her father's long illness was not a good sign, only a sign that the body had given up arguing. There was a gate in the wall that should by every account have been locked, and was not. She stood before it a long moment, with the rain running off the end of her nose, and told herself that a girl with nowhere to go, and a locked door in front of her, was one kind of unlucky. But a girl with nowhere to go, and an unlocked door was being given something, and it would be a poor sort of gratitude to stand there, arguing with the sky about whether she deserved it. She went through. Behind her, far off on the Tor road, a single light moved that she did not see, a lantern swinging at the pace of a man walking fast and alone toward the same gate. Though neither of them knew that yet, and would not know it for another hour, and the not knowing was the last easy thing that would happen to either of them for some months to come. The house itself, when the drive finally turned and showed it to her hole, looked less like shelter than like a held breath. Every window was dark. Ivy had taken the east wing entirely, and what had once been a fine gravel sweep before the door had gone to moss so thick it swallowed her footsteps. She smelled dust before she smelled anything else, dust and cold stone, and underneath it very faint beeswax, which meant someone had polished something in that house inside a year, which did not match anything else about it, though she was too wet and too tired to wonder at that yet. The door was not locked either. She told herself this was luck continuing, and pushed it open, and stepped into a hall so large that her own breathing sounded strange to her, too loud, too small a sound for too much room. The hall swallowed the last grey light from the door behind her and gave nothing back. She stood dripping on stone flags worn into a shallow trough by 200 years of feet, and above her, somewhere in the dark, a clock that should have been ticking was not, and the silence where its sound should have been was its own kind of cold. She found a passage, and a room with a hearth gone to ash, and enough dry kindling stacked beside it, oddly, neatly, that she wondered again about the beeswax smell, and did not let herself finish the wondering, because a fire was a fire, and she had stopped being able to afford questions somewhere around noon that day. She had the flint going, and a small flame catching in dry moss, when the door behind her opened without a knock, and a man's shadow filled it before the man himself did, and every muscle in her went still the way a hare goes still, not from courage, but from the simple animal knowledge that running was no longer an option worth trying. He was travel-stained, coat dark with the same rain that had soaked her, a workman's ring of plain iron on his hand rather than any of the gold she might have expected from a house this size, and he carried himself, she would think later, like a man unused to entering rooms without being announced into them, though she did not think that yet. She only thought, trespasser, same as me, and felt a small, mean flicker of relief that whoever had lit this house's kindling was not standing here accusing her of it. "Who let you in?" he said, and it was not unkind, only flat, the voice of a man testing the weight of a plank before he put his foot on it. "The gate did," she said. It was open. That was true enough not to be a lie, and she said it looking at him rather than at the fire, because she had learned from her father that the surest way to seem guilty was to seem too interested in flames. He looked at her a long moment, at the tin box, at the small carved bird still gripped in her free hand, and something in his face eased by a degree she could not have named, but felt all the same, the way you feel a held door stop pushing back. "There's dry wood in the scullery too," he said. "I found some myself an hour ago." Then, because that admission seemed to cost him something, he added that he had not expected the house to have another visitor tonight, of all nights, and she said that she had not expected the house to have anyone in it at all, which was the truer sentence of the two. And for a moment neither of them said anything further, and the fire cracked once, loudly, and both of them flinched at the same instant and then, absurdly, almost laughed. He did not give her his name, and she did not ask for it, because names, in her experience of that year, were the sort of thing that came with obligations attached, and she was too tired to take on any more of those tonight. He gave her his coat instead, dry on the inside where his body had kept it warm, and told her the fire in the next room along drew better, and left her to it without another word. And she sat a long while with the wren pressed into her palm, its worn back smooth under her thumb where she had rubbed it 1,000 times without noticing she did it, and thought that whatever else this house was, it had for one night been exactly generous enough. Crane arrived with the sun, which Wren would come to learn was entirely characteristic of him, since he preferred to be seen doing his duty in good light. She heard the horses first, then boots on the gravel, then a voice pitched to Carrie, asking the empty air whether anyone had thought to air the east rooms as instructed, and she came out onto the gallery above the hall in time to see it all. precise man in an excellent grey coat stop dead at the sight of her, and watch his face do something she would spend a great deal of the following weeks trying to read correctly. It was not surprise exactly. It arrived, and passed too fast for that. "Miss Ashby," he said, and the fact that he knew her name before she had offered it told her more about the state of her fortunes than the eviction notice had. "I confess I did not expect to find you here." She said that she had not expected to find herself here either, and he smiled, and it was a good smile, warm at the corners, the kind of smile that had likely opened a great many doors for Josiah Crane over a great many years, and it reached his eyes half a second after it reached his mouth, and left them half a second before it left the rest of his face, and later she would understand that this half second was the truest thing about him, and she had simply not yet learned to read it. "This house is not open to the public," he said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man explaining a rule he had not made, and did not particularly enjoy enforcing, though enforce it he would. "I am obliged to have you removed, and given the circumstance of your family's account, I am afraid removed will mean rather more than it might for another sort of trespasser." It was the stranger from the night before who answered him, coming down the great stair with his collar still open and his boots unpolished. And something in the way Crane's whole bearing changed at the sight of him, some fractional straightening, some new carefulness around the eyes, told Wren before a single word was spoken that whoever this man was, he was not what she had assumed. "Crane," he said. The single word landed in the hall like a dropped coin, small and precise and impossible to ignore. "Miss Ashby is here at my invitation." Crane's recovery was so smooth she almost missed that there had been anything to recover from. "Your Grace," he said, and bowed, and Wren felt the floor tilt very slightly under her, the particular vertigo of discovering that a night's shelter had been granted to her, without her knowing it, by the one man in the county with the power to grant or refuse it absolutely. She did not curtsy. She would think afterward that she ought to have, and that the not doing so had been less defiance than simple shock, her legs having apparently decided the matter without consulting the rest of her. Gabriel Vane, Duke of Alderwood, looked, in that unguarded instant, considerably less pleased to have his rank announced than she was to hear it. Crane had already moved on, brisk, professional, laying out for the Duke's benefit an account of the Ashby debt, the arrears. The necessity that had led to the family's removal from the tenancy at Michaelmas, delivered in the tone of a man reciting an inventory rather than a ruin, and Wren stood and listened to her father's whole last decade summarised in 4 sentences by a man who had never once, in all that decade, come to the cottage door to say a kind word to a dying man. When Crane had finished, the Duke asked her directly whether the account was accurate, and something in her chest that had been holding very still for 11 months cracked clean through. "My father paid it," she said. "He paid every farthing of it 3 years before he died, and I do not know why the ledger says otherwise, only that it does. And that no one troubled to ask me before they nailed the notice to my door." Crane's expression did not change so much as settle, the smile going nowhere but somehow growing thinner for staying exactly where it was. "Grief plays strange tricks with memory," he said gently, and it was the gentleness that frightened her most, because it left her nothing to push against. The Duke did not answer him at all. He looked at Wren instead, for a long moment, the way a man looks at a column of figures he suspects do not add, and told Crane, in the same flat voice he had used on her the night before, that the matter would be reviewed properly before anything further was done, and that Miss Ashby would remain at the Hall in the meantime. in whatever capacity suited the household's needs. Crane bowed again, and agreed, and smiled his good warm smile, and Wren watched him go, and understood, without yet being able to say why, that she had just made an enemy considerably more dangerous than an empty larder. They found the clock that same afternoon, though it would be truer to say the clock found them, since it stood where it had always stood, in the case of dark oak against the east wall of the long gallery, its hands stopped at 11 minutes past 4, and its face gone dull with 2 years of dust. Gabriel stood before it a long while, with his hand resting flat on the case, and told her, without her asking, that it had stopped the afternoon his father died, and that no one in the house had had the heart, or perhaps the nerve, to wind it since. My father's man kept it running 30 years, he said. Ashby, I think his name was. He said something about hands going still on their own account once. She said that was likely her own father, since there was no other clock-mender named Ashby for 40 miles, and something passed over his face that she could not read, some private reckoning, and he asked, carefully, whether she had learnt the trade herself. She told him she had, from the age of 8, her father's hands over hers on the small tools until her own grew steady enough to trust alone, and that she could likely have this clock striking the hour again inside a week if the house could spare the coal to keep the workroom warm enough for her fingers to work. It was, she would realise only later, the first whole true thing she had said to him without calculating the cost of saying it first. He offered her the work outright, a wage, a room in the servants' wing, the run of the old workroom off the gallery, and she took it before she had properly weighed what it meant to accept anything at all from a man who, until that morning, she had believed to be a trespasser same as herself. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, arrived to interrupt them with a question about airing linens that could plainly have waited, and stood in the doorway afterward a beat too long, watching the two of them with the clock between them, before she left again without comment, and Wren understood that whatever had passed unspoken in that gallery had been seen and would be spoken of below stairs before. Supper. That night, alone in the workroom with the case opened and the movement laid bare under a single candle, she ran her fingers along 30 years of another man's careful work, every pin and gear filed true, every joint oiled with a patience she recognised in her own hands, and found tucked behind the great wheel where no inspection would ever think to look, the corner of a folded paper, brittle and yellowed, that had clearly been there a very long time. She did not pull it free that night. Something in her, some old caution her father had taught her without ever quite explaining why, told her to leave it exactly where it lay until she understood what she was looking at, and she closed the case again, with her heart going harder than the work alone accounted for, and sat a long while with the small wooden wren turning over and over in her palm, and did not sleep for a long time after the candle guttered out. The weeks that followed lay heavy and hot across Alderwood, the kind of thick, unmoving summer heat that makes the whole county wait for a storm, without admitting aloud that it is waiting. Wren worked the clock by day, and asked her quiet questions by night, and it was old Tobias Reed, who had kept the grounds at Alderwood since before the old Duke's own father was buried, who first told her plainly that some things in that house were better waited out than dug for. He found her in the walled garden one evening, turning the wren carving over in her fingers the way she did when her mind was elsewhere, and he watched her a while before he spoke, in the manner of a man who had learned patience from 40 years, of things that grew slowly. "Your father sat on that same bench more times than I could count," he said, and did not wait to be asked before he sat beside her. Good hands, bad luck with the men he trusted. Wren asked him, as plainly as she dared, whether he knew anything of the debt, the ledger, the reason her father's account had shown arrears that her father swore, to his last week of breath, he did not owe. Tobias was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer at all. "A thing that's gone," he said finally, "asks nothing further of you. You bury it, you grieve it, you're done. A thing that's only buried, though, that's a different creature entirely. It waits. It doesn't much care how long." He looked at her sideways, the way old men look at young women they have decided, privately and without announcement, to help. "Your father wasn't a man who lost track of a debt," he said. "He was a man who kept 2 of every book he ever balanced, out of habit, because he'd been cheated once as a young man and never forgot the lesson of it. If the ledger up at the estate office says one thing, I'd not go looking there first for the truth of it. I'd go looking wherever your father hid his second book." She did not sleep that night either, turning that sentence over and over, and in the morning she went back to the clock case with a lamp and steadier hands, and drew the folded paper free at last from behind the great wheel, and found, beneath it, a second, thicker bundle her searching fingers had missed the first time, tied with the same waxed cord her father had always used for his own private accounts. She was still reading, in the grey early light, when she heard the workroom door open behind her, and turned, and found Josiah Crane standing in it, his good coat immaculate even at that hour, his eyes gone very still on the papers in her hands. He did not raise his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had. "That," he said, looking at the bundle with an expression she would only later be able to name as the particular calm of a man watching a debt come due, "is estate property, Miss Ashby, and you would do well to hand it to me now, before this becomes a matter for the constable rather than for polite conversation." She held the papers against her chest instead, and told him, with a steadiness that surprised her more than it seemed to surprise him, that she had read enough of them already to know what they were, a discharge in her father's own hand, dated 3 years before his death, receipted and witnessed, proof plain as daylight that the Ashby debt had been settled in full, and beneath it, in a second hand she recognised after a moment as the old Duke's own, a private note questioning why the estate ledgers continued to show the account open a full year after the discharge was filed. Crane's face did not change, not exactly, but something behind it seemed to recalculate, the way a man's face does when a wager he thought safe suddenly is not. "You misread an old man's confusion for a conspiracy," he said, and the words came out smooth as ever, though the smile that usually rode along beneath them was, for once, entirely absent. The old Duke was unwell those last years. His notes are not evidence of anything but a failing mind. She told him that a court might see it differently, particularly once it was set beside the newer ledgers she had also found in that bundle, ledgers in Crane's own hand showing rents collected from 3 tenancies, including her father's, that never once appeared in the estate's official books, sums that instead, if the dates could be trusted, matched almost exactly to the purchase, over the same years. Of 2 farms and a mill some 15 miles distant, all of it recorded under a name that was not Crane's own, but that Tobias, when she asked him later, confirmed without hesitation was his late wife's maiden name. Crane took one step toward her then, and stopped himself, and the stopping told her everything the step had not. "You do not understand what you are holding," he said, and for the first time there was something underneath the smoothness, something that might, in a less careful man, have been fear. "I did not build this from cruelty, Miss Ashby. I built it because a steward's wage does not keep a family, and because your father's little debt, real or not, was never going to ruin anyone, whereas the alternative, questioned too loudly, would ruin a great many people who have done nothing wrong at all, myself very much included. It was, she would think later, the most honest sentence he ever said to her, and it did not move her half an inch. He left without taking the papers, because taking them by force in the Duke's own house, from the Duke's own clockmender, was a risk even Josiah Crane was not yet prepared to run, and Wren stood alone in the workroom a long while afterward with her heart going hard, and the wren carving cold in her closed fist, and did not yet know that the worst of the morning was still ahead of her, arriving in the shape of the Dowager Duchess, who had come down from London 3 days early for her grandson's homecoming, and who found Wren not 10 minutes later standing in the gallery, with a bundle of stolen-looking papers clutched to her chest, and no earthly explanation ready on her tongue. The Dowager Duchess Seraphina had outlived 2 husbands, and, by her own frequent account, every illusion she had ever held about the goodness of strangers, and she regarded Wren now with the flat, assessing patience of a woman who had spent 60 years learning to read a liar's face, and had very seldom been wrong. "You will explain yourself," she said, in a voice that required no raising to fill the whole gallery, "or I will have you removed from this house within the hour, and I promise you the reviewing of the matter will not go nearly so gently as my grandson's did." Wren told her the truth plainly, without embellishment, because she had already learned that morning what embellishment cost, and because some stubborn part of her father lived on in her still, and would not let her soften a fact simply because the woman hearing it was formidable. She held out the papers. The Dowager did not take them at once. She looked instead for a long moment at Wren's face, and then, unexpectedly, at the small wooden bird still gripped in her other hand, and asked, in an entirely different tone, whether that was Silas Ashby's work. Wren said that it was, and the Dowager's face did something complicated and brief, gone before Wren could name it, and she said that she had known Silas Ashby 40 years, had trusted him with the timepiece her own late husband had carried at Waterloo, and had never in all that time known him to lie about so much as the hour. Only then did she take the papers, and read them where she stood, in full daylight, without sitting, her spectacles catching the sun, and when she had finished she said nothing at all for a long while, which Wren would come to understand was, for the Dowager, a far more alarming reaction than shouting would have been. It was Gabriel's arrival, drawn by Mrs. Price's hurried summons, that broke the silence, and it was the sight of his grandmother's face, ashen under her powder, that told him before either woman spoke that something in his house had come apart. He read the papers in his turn, standing very still, and Wren watched his composure do a great deal of quiet, expensive work to remain composure at all. And when he finally looked up, it was not at the papers, but at her, and what was in his face frightened her more than Crane's stillness had, because it was not anger, it was calculation, the particular grief of a man doing arithmetic on how much this discovery was about to cost the people he loved. He came to her that evening in the small parlour off the gallery, where she sat with the clock's spare parts spread before her, though her hands had done no work on them for an hour, and told her, in a voice stripped of all its earlier warmth, that she should leave Alderwood before the week was out. It was, he said, not a matter of doubting her, or the papers, or her father's memory, all of which he believed entirely. It was a matter of Cordelia's family, whose money the estate needed badly enough to make the betrothal a near necessity, regardless of any man's private wishes, and of Crane, who held enough threads of the county's business in his hands to do a great deal of damage on his way down if he were cornered too fast and too publicly, and of his grandmother, whose health he would not risk on a scandal fought carelessly. "I am trying to protect you," he said, and she heard in it, underneath the careful reasoning, something that sounded very much like the same thing Crane had said that morning, a decent argument built to justify an indecent conclusion. She told him, flatly, that she had been protected out of one home already this year by men who called it necessity, and did not much care to be protected out of a second. He did not answer that. He only looked at her, and turned the plain iron ring on his finger once, the gesture she had by now, watched him make a dozen times without understanding what it meant, and said nothing further, and the nothing was its own answer, and she took it, wrongly, for exactly the rejection it was not quite intended to be. She left before dawn, on foot, with the tin box and the wren and nothing else, and did not look back at Alderwood Hall even once, which was, this time, entirely true. Tobias found her 3 days later, in the yard of a coaching inn 2 villages off, thinner already, mending a farmer's clock for bread, and told her without preamble that the house had gone to pieces since she left, that the dowager had not spoken to her grandson above 10 words together, that Crane had vanished from the estate office 2 mornings running on business he would not name, and that Lady Cordelia Fairweather herself, arriving early for the formal homecoming, had taken one look at the state of the household and demanded to know precisely what she was being married into. "He is not a man who explains himself well when he is frightened," Tobias said, meaning Gabriel, and Wren said that she had noticed, and Tobias almost smiled, the first almost smile she had seen on him since her father's funeral. "Your father used to say a stopped clock hasn't died," he said. "It's only waiting to be asked the time. Someone ought to go back and ask it." She went back the next morning, in the same wet coat she had left in, and arrived at Alderwood in time to find the great hall filling with the county's better families for the homecoming that Crane, with a nerve that would afterwards strike everyone as either magnificent or insane, had chosen as the evening to present his own accounts of the estate to the assembled guests, in a final effort, she understood later, to bury the truth under so much public ceremony that no one would think to dig for it again. She walked into that hall in her travel-stained coat, with the bundle of papers still bound in their waxed cord, and the room's polite noise died by degrees as heads turned, and Crane, standing at the front beside a table laid with the estate's ledgers for the assembled company's approval, went very still at the sight of her, his hand rising to smooth the edge of his sleeve, the small, fastidious gesture she now recognised for exactly what it was. "Miss Ashby," he said, recovering fast, "has, I am afraid, some difficulty distinguishing memory from fact. A trouble that runs, I understand, in her family." "Read it aloud," Wren said, and did not raise her voice to say it, which was somehow louder in that room than shouting would have been. "Read the discharge aloud, and the ledger beside it, so that everyone here hears the same words at the same time. And if I am wrong, you may have me removed by whichever constable you like, and I will not trouble this house again." It was the dowager who crossed the hall and took the papers from her hands, and it was the dowager's voice, clear and carrying and entirely without mercy. That read the discharge first, then the old Duke's questioning note, then name by name and sum by sum. The second ledger with its farms and its mill bought under a dead woman's maiden name, and the silence that fell over that room as she read was the particular silence of a great many people doing arithmetic all at once. Crane's composure held through the discharge and through the note, and broke only at the ledger, at the sound of his own hands' work read back to him in a voice too old and too certain to be argued with, and he lunged, one sharp involuntary step toward the dowager and the papers in her hand, before catching himself half a second too late for the movement to look like anything but exactly what it was. No one touched him. No one needed to. Lady Cordelia Fairweather, standing near the door in pale blue silk, was the one who spoke into the silence that followed, and what she said Wren would remember for the rest of her life, delivered with a dry, level composure that made the whole room's held breath let go at once. "I find," Lady Cordelia said, "that I have no wish to marry into a scandal I did not commission, and every wish to see the man who commissioned it removed from this house before the soup is served." And she looked at Gabriel, not unkindly, and told him that she had rather liked him, in the manner one likes a well-made chair, and would continue to wish him well from a safe and unbetrothed distance, which drew, astonishingly, a ripple of relieved laughter from a room that badly needed permission to laugh about something. Crane left under his own power, escorted only as far as the door, and at the threshold he turned back once, and looked at Wren, and said, quietly, that he had been right about one thing at least. That sentiment was a luxury the estate could not afford, and that he wondered whether she would find it any more affordable than he had. Then he was gone, out into the dark, and the room began, slowly, to breathe again, and to empty, in twos and threes, out into the summer night, until only a handful remained. Gabriel found her afterward in the long gallery, before the clock, which she had finished mending that very week, and which now kept the hour as steadily as it ever had under her father's care. "I should not have asked you to go," he said without preamble, and turned the iron ring on his finger, and then, deliberately, stopped himself doing it, and told her that the ring had been his father's, and that he wore it, he realized only lately, the way she carried her Wren, which was to say as a small stubborn refusal to let go of a man he had lost too early to properly know. "I told myself I was protecting you," he said. "I have since had a great deal of time to consider that I was only protecting myself from the trouble of choosing you plainly, in front of people whose good opinion I had been taught to value more than I ought." Wren told him in return that she had mistaken his sending her away for the same thing she had known all her life, which was a door closing, because she was inconvenient to whoever stood on the other side of it, and that she had been wrong about that, and was tired, she found, of being wrong about people out of habit rather than evidence. "I will not be sent anywhere again," she said, "not for my own good, not for the estate's good, not for anyone's good but my own say-so, and if that is a condition you cannot live with, then we had better find that out tonight rather than later." He said that it was not a condition, it was simply how he intended to go on treating her regardless, and that he had additional conditions of his own to offer if she would hear them, and she said that she would hear them. And he told her, plainly, without ornament, that her father's name would be cleared publicly, and in writing before the county's assembled families within the month, that the Ashby cottage and its land would be restored to her outright, in her own name and no one else's, and that the workroom off the gallery was hers for as long as she wanted it, clock or no clock, marriage or no marriage, because a trade like hers, he had come to believe, was not the sort of thing a person ought to be asked to set down for the sake of a title. She told him that was 3 conditions, and she had expected to be the one naming them, and he said that he had simply saved her the trouble, and it was very nearly a joke, the first he had risked in her hearing, and she laughed, honestly, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. A year turned before the wedding, quietly, without the county's whole attention fixed on it the way Crane's scandal had briefly fixed it, and by the time autumn came round again to Alderwood, the wrens had come back to nest under the east eave for the first time in 3 summers, a small ordinary miracle nobody but Tobias thought to remark on aloud. On the evening of the anniversary of the storm that had first brought her to that door, Wren stood in the great hall with the clock ticking steady and true behind her. The small carved wren set now on its case where anyone entering could see it, worn smooth at the back, from 1,000 thumbs that were not only hers any more, since Gabriel had taken to touching it too, without seeming to notice he did. The rain had come on hard again that night, drumming on the old glass, and when the knock came at the door it was neither of them who answered it, but Mrs. Price, and the voice that came in out of the wet was young, a boy from the Alderford Road, whose family had lost their tenancy to a bad harvest and a worse landlord 2 farms over, asking only, in a voice trying very hard not to shake, whether there might be dry wood and a corner of floor to sleep on until morning. Wren was already crossing the hall before Mrs. Price had finished repeating the question, and she opened the door herself, wide, into the storm, and told the boy that there was dry wood, and a fire already lit in the room just along the passage, and that he was not to thank her for it, because someone else had once done exactly the same for her on a night no better than this one, and she had simply been waiting, she said, for her turn to pass it on. Behind her, Gabriel watched her cross that threshold and understood, not for the first time, but more completely than he ever had before, that the house had not truly become a home again the day the clock started ticking, nor the day the papers were read aloud, nor even the day they were married, but on some ordinary evening exactly like this one, when a stranger stood dripping in the doorway and was let in without a single question asked first. And that is where we will leave them. The clock keeping time in the hall behind them, the fire caught and holding, the rain finding nothing left in that house to be afraid of. If this one kept you close tonight, stay by the fire a little longer before you go. Tell me, in a word below, which part of it stayed with you longest, whether it was Wren's stubborn little bird, or the discharge read aloud in that ashen hall, or a plain iron ring turned once too often on a nervous hand. And while you're there, settle in with Doxistia Channel _Namey Gigi, so the next story finds you the moment it's lit. The kettle's already on for it. Sleep well tonight, be gentle with the people who knock on your door, and I'll see you at the next fire.